Hello, everybody. This is Nick Vlahos with Nick in the Morning, the podcast. We are here in beautiful Peoria, Illinois, and sitting with the wonderful Mr. Chris Kaergard, who is our kind of Johnny on the spot, do everything, be everything here at the newspaper. We share a column, byline every week, Word on the Street, which appears in the Monday Journal Star. It appears Sunday night online at pjstar.com, where we kind of write about political things or things in general going on with city government or area governments or even state governments a lot of times, and sometimes national too, for that matter. And we thought we'd bring in Chris for a little chat and tell us about himself, tell us about what he does, and talk about maybe some of the hotter issues going on in the Tri-County area these days. How are you, sir?
I'm delightful, thank you.
Oh, I thought you were going to say like fine and dandy or something. Or fine or dandy, but not fine and dandy.
No. We'll up it straight away to delightful and see if we can keep it at that level.
It's pretty good for a Monday to be delightful,
Yeah,
I'll tell you what. Tell me a little bit about yourself. I mean, where are you from? How did you get involved in getting into journalism, all that sort of thing?
Sure. Well, I was originally never supposed to go into journalism. It's certainly not what I ever planned to do. I grew up in the Chicago suburbs, St. Charles, and came down to Bradley as the school that felt most comfortable out of all the ones that we looked at. Went there for 4 years, worked all 4 years at the student paper there, the Scout, and ended up, without intending to be, becoming the editor my senior year. I studied history while I was there. The original plan was I was going to be a high school history teacher.
Was that your major? Was it history?
My major was history education for a while, back and forth. I actually did, through the program at Bradley, they put you in early to schools to observe there and get a feel for what you're going to be doing even before you get into student teaching. Had a wonderful observation experience at Peoria High. The kids at Central were great. They were all sorts of fun. Had a wonderful teacher there who kind of let me, wasn't student teaching, but kind of take the reins for a discussion every couple of weeks with the kids. Then I did observation in a middle school. And
a little different?
Very different. East Peoria Central Middle School, or junior high at the time. And the kids there were different. They were typical middle school children, but it gave me some second thoughts about the profession, and I kind of realized I still had fun doing it. I still love history, but I would burn out teaching at the primary, secondary level fairly quickly. And the last thing you want is a teacher who's burned out, who's just going through the motions, doing it because, well, I've got tenure, and what else am I going to do?
Yeah, you don't want to tick off the days until retirement.
Right,
sort of
exactly.
Too,
so I kind of dropped that and figured something will come to me.
When did something come to you?
About 3 months before graduation, I found a great grad school program down at the University of Illinois Springfield, Public Affairs Reporting, to apply to. They, at the time, took about 15, 18 kids a year. Now it's kind of shrunk as the press corps has shrunk, but they take kids, and it's a full-scale immersion program. You spend a semester learning how is Illinois state government supposed to work. And then you spend a semester covering the entire legislative session from the opening gavel in January all the way through the closing gavel at the end of May. You work with a bureau chief down there, somebody who's covering for a specific news outlet, and they treat you like a full-time reporter. You're expected to produce front-page stories for them. You're expected to go to committee hearings, stand out in the rain and wait for the governor to blow you off at an event, all the good stuff that we do in the professional world.
What year was that?
That was 2004 into 2005
that
I did that. So the grand old days of Rod Blagojevich.
And we had the grand old days of his hair on top of it as well. What newspaper, what media outlet did you work for?
I worked for the Rockford Register-Star at the time, which had its own bureau down in Springfield and covered local material, local issues, local delegation for Rockford, while based in Springfield.
There was a person a full-time person from the Rockford paper that was there, stationed there all the time.
Exactly.
And it was basically a two-person.
Right, a two-man shop during the session, and then when the interns left at the end of the session and hopefully got jobs, he was on his own from June or July all the way through until December, when very little goes on in Springfield.
And this was a one-year program, at which point you ended up getting a master's degree.
Getting a master's degree and then going on the job search. And the Journal-Star, where I had interned between graduating and starting this program, was gracious enough at that point to have an opening and to consider me for it and to say, yes to my application.
If I remember correctly, when you started here, which was what, in about 2005?
2005, summer, July of
Okay,
05.
you were on the copy desk at that point, right?
Right.
You were not a writer.
Exactly, and that was kind of a reaction to having covered state government for a while and not knowing how any given day was going to go. You could start a day in Springfield at 7 in the morning and not have a guarantee that you'd be done before 10 o'clock at night, and those days can wear on you pretty quickly after a while, especially when you're someone young, when you're in a relationship, when you want to have kind of a home life. And I wanted something that was predictable. And the hours for copy editing, which are at the time and still are about 4 to midnight, were cruddy hours, and the people who work those second shift hours don't get nearly enough credit for it.
No, they don't.
Now, you know that,
I
having
did that
worked it for a quarter century.
Many years, yes.
But they're predictable. There's really not much making of a newspaper you can do after the newspaper is made for the night. Mm-hmm. So you could rely on being off and going home at midnight or thereabouts every night. You could rely on having set days off. You could rely on having a predictable schedule. And that's kind of what I wanted coming out of the program for a couple of years. And then some other opportunities came along after that.
I want to go back a second and
Yeah.
talk about your experience covering the State House. What was that like?
It's radically different when I look back at what it was then compared to what it is now. Part of that is that it was a much larger press corps in there. You had Bloomington had a separate bureau from Decatur and the Southern Illinoisan before Lee ended up buying all of them out. We had a bureau that was really just Springfield, Peoria, and Galesburg coverage. Without Rockford, there were a lot more television. So there were many more people there, which meant a lot more attention on individual lawmakers and their legislation. Now we've kind of absorbed more of that up at the individual paper level as we follow legislation that they produce. Two, it was different because you really had social media in its infancy. Remember, Facebook didn't become something that any person out on the street could join until around 2005, 2006. Before that, you had to be somebody with a .edu college address to join the Facebook at the time. So you didn't have everybody posting news articles there. Twitter wasn't yet a glimmer in anybody's eye in 2005. Blogs were just really becoming something that people turned to for getting their news. So it was a little more leisurely atmosphere in how you were chasing stories. There was a push sometimes to, well, yeah, if you can get me something early for the noon update for the website, that sort of thing was occasionally encouraged. But for the most part, everybody was just kind of expected, hey, produce a story and do it by 5 o'clock or so, and we can get it in the paper for the next morning. And I compare that to the live tweeting that I see coming out of legislative hearings right now, and it's a whole different world. It is. And there was a lot more comity between the parties then. Of course, Republicans would get irritated at Democrats, and Democrats irritated at Republicans over some basic things. The budget was always a partisan activity no matter what the year. But there was a lot less open partisan disagreement on the floor. And at the time, you had everybody kind of unified against a goofball governor and Rod Blagojevich, who nobody trusted. The Republicans couldn't abide him. The Democrats couldn't trust him. It was only a handful of people who had good relationships with him. And some of those weren't professional relationships. Tom Cross, who was the Republican House leader, was buddies with Blagojevich because they liked jogging. That didn't mean he trusted him as far as he could throw him, but the guys enjoyed jogging.
At least
together.
they like to run together in the morning or something.
Yeah.
Was that the biggest thing that you covered down there? Was all the Vlahos stuff, all the ancillary things that were going on with him? What was the biggest thing that you covered down there, do you think?
That probably was the biggest. At the time, we didn't think about it as being as big as it was, but in the budget that year, they took pension holiday. That is, they decided not to make the state's payments to the pensions that year, which we're seeing the impact of a decade plus later that, all of the interest has accelerated from not having made the payments. The garden variety rudeness from people like Blagojevich, who once, outside of an event, the opening of the Lincoln Presidential Library, not the museum across the street, but the library, reporters were there to ask him things about whatever the scandal du jour was. I can't even remember. And after hiding behind some school kids for a while, he finally came out, went straight into the SUV as though, oh, okay, I'm going to take your questions now, as he leaned out the window. And out of the corner of his mouth, he told the driver, "Gun it." And they took off down the street.
I remember that. Yep.
And then, yeah, I thought, okay, it's a weird way to go to the airport because they should have just kept going straight. But they turned as though they were going back out to the interstate. Turned out they were making a square around the block to come back. The SUV slows up again. Rod kind of leans out, gets this hangdog look on his face. Okay, sorry, I tricked you. Leans out like he's ready to take our questions. You know what the son of a gun does again? Tells the driver to gun it, and they take off down the street.
That's kind of indicative of the entire Rod Blagojevich persona, isn't it, in a lot of ways?
Yeah. All kinds of either pranksterism or not taking things seriously, certainly not a willingness to engage with the media and be serious with them. It was frustrating covering him.
Most people, I think, maybe by the time he ran for re-election, kind of knew what he was all about, but he still managed to be a fairly credible candidate in Judy Bar-Topinka, who was the state, I can't remember if she was
treasurer.
She was the treasurer back then. Why do you think that was?
Basically because he had a bunch of money early on, and he just carpet bombed the airwaves with all kinds of advertisements about her, trying to tie her to past Republican scandals. The number of times the commercial ran about Judy Bar-Topinka polkaing with George Ryan at an inauguration. He basically tied her to the last felonious Illinois governor, and through implication said, oh, well, gee, she's got to be a crook too. And at that point, people are scratching their heads. Well, you know, I could vote for the crook with the good hair who's in there now, or the crook with the orange hair who wants to get in there. But either way, they're both crooks. Not much of a choice. People aren't inclined to change horses midstream. And Judy also had a couple other things stacked against her. The Illinois Republican Party was starting to make a sharp turn to the right. She had taken some flack she had been the chairman of the party when Jack Ryan, not the CIA character, when Jack Ryan, the former investment banker and former husband to Jerry Ryan, stepped down in a sex scandal from running for Senate. In the effort to replace him on the ballot, Judy eventually kind of either backed away or got forced out of that endeavor and handed it over to the far right wing, who brought in Alan Keyes, the 27% solution, who managed, I mean, he was a Republican candidate who lost Woodford County. That takes some doing.
It does take some doing. Granted, he was running against Barack Obama, who was kind of a little bit of a force of nature, but still, I mean, that's pretty bad.
Right. So just an absurd time in Springfield that whole year.
And you were there for a good chunk of it, it sounded like. Yeah. I grew up in the west suburbs of Chicago, and I was a constituent of Judy Bar-Topinka's in the state Senate and in the state House. And nobody could wear a pantsuit or smoke a cigarette quite like Judy could. And she was
she was always a treat when she came here for her interviews. She loved going to the Goodwill right down the hill from us to shop, either before or after the interview. She'd come with her Dunkin' Donuts styrofoam cup full of coffee, and before she left here, she would top her coffee off with Journal Star newsroom coffee. Never was she more disappointed than when she heard we had gotten rid of the subsidized coffee down in the cafeteria that the company used to provide.
She might have been more upset about that than some of us were, actually.
and people here were upset about that.
That's right.
Never mind that nobody actually paid in on the honor system for it.
Well, you know, if anybody knows anything about Berwyn, Cicero, and Riverside, she was quintessential all three of those places. She was quite the woman. We got a little far afield here on your timeline, but when you started at the Journal, you were a copy editor, and then you worked your way into being one of the editorial board members. Is that correct?
Right, absolutely. I had been, one of my jobs on the copy desk had been when folks on the editorial page took a vacation and their regular layout person wasn't there, I stepped in and did the layout and managed to through some of my discussion there, show the editorial page editor that I was at least familiar with some of the issues that were going on, had an interest in politics, and when a vacancy came open, I interviewed for it, avoided the body blocks from some of the people in the newsroom who were trying to keep me out here, and went back there and did a 3-year stint on the editorial page interviewing candidates and trying to get some changes around Peoria and around the state.
What kind of an experience was that like, and did you actually affect any changes from your perspective?
Yeah, it was a fun experience. It was totally different from being on the copy desk, totally different from reporting, because for once you're allowed to have an opinion, at least the opinion of the institution on issues, and take the view of all right, well, what is this paper as an institution stood for in terms of bettering the community, bettering state government, bettering national discourse, and where do we stand on those issues and advocate for positive change. Mm-hmm. One of the places we did do that and got name-checked a couple of places by the then Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court was we got them to change a twitchy little rule, and I'm going to give the Reader's Digest version of this so our listeners stay awake. But at the time, there was a rule in court procedure that appellate courts, when they issued rulings, could issue them one of two ways. They could issue a binding ruling that could count as setting a precedent, or if it was a twitchy technicality in a case, it would be a non-precedent-setting ruling. Those cases were never published. The only people they ever told about the results were the parties involved, so the state's attorney and the local defense attorney. And if the state's attorney didn't say, hey, the appellate court issued a ruling that freed this guy,
nobody would ever know.
Nobody would ever know. Well, that came to a head when the appellate court up in Ottawa got the Deion Alexander case. You remember Deion Alexander was the guy who decided to shoot up Woodruff High School in a beef with a fellow student, and took a gun out and started firing in the hallway during passing period, and only through the grace of God didn't hit anybody during that whole encounter, was sent to prison. The appellate court ruled on a technicality, the case had to be sent back. It seemed bizarre that a case like that would be sent back and there would be no public notice of it, that you freed somebody from that violent of an incident and sent him back to an area where he would be with and around the people who had also been involved in that incident.
How did you find out about it?
We found out about it when the state's attorney at the time kicked up a stink about it. But you can't always depend on the state's attorney to do that, and not every county, not every newspaper has a decent working journalistic relationship between the state's attorney and the local media to find these things out. Mm-hmm. Nor is every state's attorney as on the ball as the ones we've had around here. We found out about that, and it started a series of editorials essentially suggesting state courts have got to be a lot more transparent about these types of things. And eventually we got the state Supremes to agree, and they had a commission of existing Supreme Court and appellate court judges who were reviewing the same thing on their end. We met with the Supreme Court Justice Tom Kilbride from this area. We gave him our opinions on why they needed to be more transparent, which coincided with the ultimate recommendation of the Judges Committee that said, hey, it doesn't hurt us to put these things out there, to publish them online, and just put a big old stamp up at the top saying, you can't cite this one if you're appealing a case. It doesn't count. Mm-hmm. So they've been publishing them ever since, and it's a lot easier for us to learn about some of the ne'er-do-wells who might either be getting set free or might be getting reduced sentences or things like that because of a technical error.
That just seems to me to be elemental in like a democratic society, to have something like that be public as opposed to just something totally under the covers.
We pay the judges' salaries. We pay for the operation of the courts. We pay through state tax dollars, too, for the state's attorney's salary in large part. So these are taxpayer-funded positions. There's an expectation of transparency that comes with those positions, and that was a large part of the point we made in the editorials, and thankfully they agreed with it. They were starting to feel their way out onto internet publication of material at that point. They set up a Twitter account for these things after our editorial. So a couple of times a day, they'll post on their Twitter account when they have new appellate court or Supreme Court rulings that have come down, and you can find them just by following the link. It's incredibly easy.
And who said Twitter was a cesspool, right? There actually there's a few gold nuggets in that whole
there can be. You just have to avoid all of the rest of the squalor to get to them.
How about it? Now, you did this for 3 years, and then you ended up coming back to the newsroom again. Is that right?
Right. The position ceased to exist as part of the general contraction of newsrooms all around the country. And at the time, our political reporter had taken a buyout and went to go work for Aaron Schock and has now been hauled before the grand jury a couple of times. I replaced her, and I remain unsubpoenaed.
For now.
For now. I replaced her as political reporter, did that for a year, and in the interim, our assignment editor went out on maternity leave and decided that she was going to move into a different job to give her more time to be home with her new family, her young family. So I sort of started to wear two hats as assignment editor and political reporter. Side note, 5 years later, I'm still waiting for the hire that will replace one of those.
So much for temporary conditions sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Right? But doing both of those, and it's really kind of interesting because in politics, you're looking very carefully in the moment on issues that are out there. What is this proposal? What does it mean to citizens around the area? What will the national health care proposal mean for Peorians? What will the tax proposal mean for an average resident of Central Illinois? What does the state budget impasse mean to not-for-profits around the area? Those are very in-the-moment kinds of questions versus the other side on the assignment desk where you're trying to think 2 or 3 days ahead with, all right, what stories do we need the reporters to be working on so that we can not only fill the paper, but so that we're answering those questions on their beats, covering East Peoria, covering education, covering healthcare. And we're lucky here. We've got reporters who are self-starters who tend not to be without ideas. So often that's just conversations on, all right, when is this going to be ready? What kind of pictures, what kind of art, what kind of graphics do you think we can have to go with it to illustrate the situation?
You don't necessarily have to lord over them and say, do this or do that, or here's an idea or there's an idea. The idea is, and it's usually better because I've been in that position too, where the ideas kind of come from the bottom up as opposed to the top down.
It's a lot better that way. Reporters have a lot more ownership of it when they're coming up with the ideas themselves. There's a lot less resentment when you're saying, here's what I want to do. Is that okay? Rather than, oh, yes, I will do this thing that you're telling me to do because you have told me to do it. Right. It's an entirely different environment with those. And the institutional memory that we have among our reporters really helps out a lot with that.
Yeah, well, we had an example of it today because Harry Whitaker, who used to be the superintendent here for a long time of the Peoria School District, District 150, he just passed away. He was 90 years old, and he'd been retired for 30 years. But during his stretch, he was a pretty legendary figure in this town, and Pam Adams covered a lot of his tenure, in various ways, shapes, and forms, and she's still here writing for us, after 40 years going on, probably almost, more than that maybe. So we'll have very thorough coverage of that incident and a lot of other ones too because of that institutional memory.
Exactly. It's a huge help to have that, and it frees me up a little bit to be thinking a little more long term. Right now we're starting to think about how we're going to be covering the primary election in the spring and paying attention to candidates for that. We're thinking about stories we're going to be doing for our Christmas fund that starts the day after Thanksgiving or day of Thanksgiving and runs all the way through the new year.
A thing I hear a lot from people who are not part of the newspaper business is how do you figure out what you're going to cover and what you're not going to cover? What is your thought process on that a lot? What's the biggest priority as far as coverage goes? How do you balance all that?
It's difficult some days and easier on others. Sometimes you've got to turn on a dime. If you've got a day with a lot of breaking news and an unexpected homicide along with major change in something in city government, along with something at the state or national level, well, you got your front page pretty well made just with those things. But you always have to have other things in your back pocket, stories that people are working on that they can switch over to when they don't have breaking news that they have to pay attention to. And as a general rule, we try to look in terms of impact on people. We're more likely to be covering something that a whole neighborhood is talking about or that a whole community is talking about whenever we possibly can. But you have to leaven that a little bit with some of the other news that you don't want to call it happy news because but a little more feature news, a little more personality driven news about things that people or organizations, not-for-profits are doing or have accomplished, because you want to reflect your community as a whole. And in a community, sometimes you have a lot more bad things happening on one day, and other days you have a lot more good, positive things that are happening. You want to be able to show a reflection of each of those things in a day's newspaper. But there's a third element of that information that people need to have, the understanding of what their governments are doing in their name and with their money, or what's being discussed in healthcare, new procedures in the area that two of our huge employers have, or action in the business community, whether that's Caterpillar or somebody else, that our role is as much explanation of those things so that people can come away as smarter, better citizens.
What stories do you like to do yourself? What stories do you like to report, and what stories do you like to read?
I like to read, frankly, a little bit of everything. I tend to prefer informational stories myself, and political, just because of my personal interest and leanings. Just to unpack what exactly does this mean, what's the background behind it. But my real joy is when I can dive in and write a little bit about history in the area, and I've had a lot of fun with that. I got to
that kind of harkens back to what you were
my history degree,
college,
and some of that is also because I think you are a better writer, whether it's healthcare, whether it's business, whether it's politics. You're a better writer of those things when you have, and I talked about it before, the institutional memory, the ability to go back and put it in context of what has happened before. And sometimes those stories can be a little more indulgent on, reaching an important anniversary or milestone. We had it earlier this year with the stories on World War I and the U.S. entry into World War I. I had the opportunity to go up to Caterpillar's archives up in Mossville and the Bradley University archives, paw through a bunch of old documents they had about the World War I training camps that were here, both on Bradley's campus, right behind where they've got the Hartman Center.
Sure.
Now, it was the gym at the time, and
Hewitt Hall, I
as a
think it was
dormitory.
called. Yeah.
And then over in East Peoria, basically where a part of the Levy District is now, over by City Hall and the library, that was a training camp that was used during World War I. And being able to dig through all of the information on that is neat. We've got another one coming up 120 years ago, almost, in the Spanish-American War. Peoria had a young man who served as a sailor during the Spanish-American War. Our naval engagements there were among some of the most lopsided that the world has ever seen. You had Admiral Dewey sail into Manila Bay and capture half the Spanish fleet there without firing a single shot. There was another naval battle in Cuba, at Santiago de Cuba, where this Peoria-born man was the only actual casualty of the naval battle.
I didn't know that.
And people at the time were aware of it. Peoria sent a delegation to New York, where his family had moved and where there was the funeral. But there's been very little discussion of it here and the death of Yeoman George Ellis. They're going to be fixing that by putting a plaque up on the Soldiers and Sailors Monument downtown in the Courthouse Plaza within the next couple of months for that. I'm going to be writing in the next few days, coming up on Veterans Day here, about the history and the story of George Ellis as a guy who most Peorians don't know anything about.
This is the first time I've ever heard anything about him, and I thought I was a fairly good student of Peoria history, but that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's been really neat to dig into that. In fact, after this or tomorrow, I'm going to be spending some time down at the public library looking through documents on him.
That's really cool. And it's yet another one of the center of the universe things that you and I talk about a lot, and and I've written about this a lot too, about how Peoria seems to have its tentacles reached all over the world and into various places and areas that you'd never suspect anybody from this area to be. Why do you think some of that is? I mean, this is a question I ask a lot. I'm not sure there's a good answer, but what's your theory on it?
I'm not sure that there really is any set theory to it other than the Midwest in general and Peoria in particular seem to be capable of producing people who can walk on the national stage and can have importance in any number of industries. This is the archetypical community, not just as a test community for products, but before that, a community as a test for entertainment, as discerning audiences, not as typical American audiences, but as a discerning one. So when people could make it here, it set them up for success elsewhere. You've got all of the good Midwest work ethic that people talk about, but you've also got what was frankly a very good educational system, an emphasis on that through the university level with Bradley that's been here for 120 years. In fact, 120 years this year.
Yeah, this year, 1897.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think all of those things come together, and part of it too is we notice and recognize those contributions from people everywhere a little more than a larger town probably would. You don't hear it from a Chicago or a Dallas or a community that size, but in one this size, we take note of where our people go and what they do after they leave here.
And I've lived in a few other communities about this size, and yeah, they have their one-off or two-off celebrities or people that have done something on a grander stage someplace, and that's about it. And they hang their hats on that, deservedly so. But here it just seems like,
we keep cranking them out.
Yeah, the wave just keeps coming and coming and coming. And you get kind of a center of the universe moment yourself, I guess, when you went to Washington, D.C. to visit some of our Congress people. The day Aaron Shack was indicted, I believe, or when he resigned.
When he resigned.
When he resigned, you were actually sitting in his office waiting to interview him on the Capitol Hill, is that right?
Yeah, just sitting there waiting, and you have CNN and NBC and all sorts of online outlets that are standing out in the hallway, and I'm sitting in the antechamber waiting to go in and talk to him. Now, he and I never actually connected that day, but there have been some very unusual moments like that where you're out there when the situation occurs for that, or whether it was to take a more depressing version of it, the shooting before the congressional softball game this year. Darren LaHood and Rodney Davis are both on that team, and that shooting occurred on the day that I was wrapping up my trip this year out there. Now, fortunately, that one for our involvement was just a matter of getting hold of Darren and Rodney and making sure that they weren't at the practice. But
it's pretty amazing stuff. I mean, when you went to Shack's office that day, did you have any idea anything was going to happen?
No inkling whatsoever. He and I had talked the week beforehand, and in fact, he had vowed at the time that he was not thinking of resignation or anything like it, that he was going to stay, he was going to fight this out. My communication with his staff through the couple of days I had been there beforehand suggested that they were going to continue. He had been at the Farmer's Share of the Dollar Food Breakfast in Peoria that very Saturday. So he had faced local media even more recently than my on-the-record conversation with him, and there was no indication whatsoever. I was sitting there in a St. Patrick's Day tie when I got the email with the indication that he was stepping down.
It had to be mind-blowing a little bit, almost surreal in some ways.
Right, and then a year later when I go back there, it was totally unintended. It was his first reappearance on Capitol Hill when the Indian Prime Minister, who he was buddies with from his travels over there, came in to make a speech to Congress. Aaron was back on the floor for his first time. This is pre-indictment, but back on the floor. He has lifetime floor privileges as long as he wears his pin. Back there listening to him speak, and the only reason I had a heads up on it was because he was on the plane out there right before I was out of O'Hare, and I got a quick little heads up from him. Hey, you may be hearing a little bit more about me in the next day or two. Want to give you a heads up on why that might be. And then we found out we were both going to be in D.C., and we arranged to have a sit-down as soon as he got done with the joint session. And that was a Q&A for us.
The object lesson here basically is every time you go to D.C., some big news happens involving a Peoria area politician.
Absolutely. So maybe I need to quit going to D.C. for a while.
Or maybe you need to go there more often, depending on your point of view. I think I don't know if it was you that said this or maybe somebody else. I think 1 year from today is the 2018 election.
It is. So we've only been enduring the race for 6 months now.
You know, anybody who's been watching TV for any length of time has seen Illinois governor's commercials. I mean, either for J.B. Pritzker, who's had a number of them, the one that Bruce Rauner's got now with the governors of Missouri and Wisconsin and Indiana saying thanks to Mike Madigan. That's
but not Minnesota.
Not Minnesota, yes, I know. Not Iowa either for some reason. Don't know why.
Iowans are nicer than that. They have campaign signs asking you to please vote for.
Yes.
It's not like Illinois, not quite as bare knuckle.
On bended knee, please vote for me. What's your best guess of what's going to go down with the governor's race in this state? Is there a best guess to have at this point?
At this point, it's still tough to say because it'd be easy to write off Bruce Rauner at this point as a vastly unpopular governor, oversaw the longest budget impasse in history, signed a bill that's massively unpopular with his right flank, really upset his center flank in a lot of different ways, seeing scores of people retire from the legislature, frankly, because they don't want to work with him and because they don't want to deal with continued impasse. But he's also done a masterful job of demonizing Mike Madigan and making him part of the story in a way that he's never been before. The leading candidate on the Democratic side, J.B. Pritzker, removes one of the arrows that Democrats typically would use, the, oh, he's rich, he's a billionaire, he doesn't understand you issue. Now, I think both of those guys have pretty compelling stories of why, even though they've got zillions more dollars than you or I or anybody in a productive career with a future would ever have, but Pritzker and Rauner still are, they're billionaires at the end of the day, and they both have a challenge to overcome of showing how they can be a guy just like you or me to most Illinoisans. On the Democratic side, it's awfully hard to handicap their seems in the polling like Pritzker has an edge, but in Illinois, you also don't want to say never for anybody a year out from the election or 4 months and change out from the primary. There's a lot that can happen in that time, and when the lights go up for those televised debates, it's a lot different than a forum before the Rotary Club or the Peoria County Democrats at a picnic down in Bartonville. You make a gaffe at one of those other things, it doesn't get quite the display it does when it's live and in living color.
Yep, no doubt about that.
There's a huge risk there for those candidates. On the Republican side, Rauner does look safe. He's being challenged by a Wheaton Republican, Jeannie Ives, in the House, who most Republicans would say is an acquired taste as a politician. But she's running in large part on this disappointment with the governor on the Republican side, on the right wing, because of Rauner's signature on a bill that not only guarantees abortion rights in Illinois if Roe v. Wade is overturned, but also expands access to abortion for low-income women with state funds. A lot of people view that as just beyond the pale. Even if they knew from the get-go that Rauner was himself pro-choice, they view that one as beyond the pale because it's the first documented time I think anyone has seen where a Republican governor has signed legislation expanding access to abortion.
Well, not only that, but if I remember correctly, didn't Rauner promise that he wasn't going to do that?
He promised some people early on in the 2014 campaign that he was foursquare for abortion rights and would sign something certainly along the lines of protect access under Roe. But then he also promised a bunch of people back in the spring, including the Cardinal up in Chicago, that he wouldn't sign it, and that's got a lot of people up in a lather too, questioning, hey, if you've got a guy who will lie to a priest, then
it's kind of bad form to lie to a cardinal, I would think,
right?
Unless it's like Mark McGuire or Ozzie
Smith
or somebody
those
like
kind,
that.
That's fine.
Lie to them. all you
anybody
want.
taking steroids, you can lie to.
This whole Madigan Rauner back and forth. I mean, a lot of people would say, well, I mean, who do you support in something like that? It's like they're both kind of like odious characters.
Pox on all their houses.
Yes, one way or another. I mean, who do you think has gotten the better of that, and who do you think is there enough blame to go around here? Do you think one side's more culpable than the other side, or what?
I think you have to fault Madigan in a lot of ways for presiding over the last 30-plus years of Illinois state government and allowing the pension holidays, not fixing some of the structural problems in the state's budget. Now, if you go back to the early 1990s, he and Jim Edgar were at daggers drawn over some of these same issues, and Jim Edgar was the guy who wanted to spend more money, and Mike Madigan was the guy who wanted to spend less money. So some of these roles flip over time on state spending, but Madigan still has to wear a lot of the blame for how the last 30 years have gone. And given the way he enforces loyalty in his caucus, sure, you can say, well, he's just the Democratic leader of the state house, so he really only has 1/4 of the power in state government. No, I'm not suggesting that all Democrats are mindless Madigan followers and that they'll vote the way he tells them to on every piece of legislation. That just ain't so. Anybody who views it that way is looking for an overly simplistic solution. But Madigan is still at the center of all of these votes and still at the center of allowing to pass a number of things that probably, arguably, for the budget should not have passed over that time. Where Rauner draws fault is in his approach in dealing with Madigan. And you get that from election night 2014 onward, when Rauner went out there and knowingly lied from the very get-go. I've had the chance to talk with Speaker Madigan, and he never actually spoke to the Speaker. His staff left a message for the Speaker's staff. And that gets you off on the wrong foot from the very beginning with someone who, and there's a great profile that we may be able to post along with this, and if not, is easily searchable through the University of Illinois Chicago with the now deceased historian Robert Remini, who did an interview with Madigan, an oral history on the first Mayor Daily. And it's a lengthy interview, and it really shows you a lot of the old school, follow the guy in charge, give him some deference. If you got to defy him in some way, you need to go to him, you need to tell him why, you need to justify it. You still ought to get his blessing. A lot of the old school ways that Madigan operates and how he came up philosophically, you get a lot from that interview on who he is as a guy. And I don't know if Rauner read that and just discarded it, decided that total war and sliming everybody's reputation was the way to go, but between his approach to Madigan from the beginning and his approach to trying to reform state government from the beginning. He put out there, 30, 40-some separate proposals, all of which had the depth and complexity of a bumper sticker during those first 6 months in office. It wasn't until you got down to crunch time in May of Rauner's first year that he actually decided to govern and introduce reform concepts that had legislative language behind them that people can haggle over. If he had been at the let's haggle over this from the get-go, they probably would have gotten a lot farther. He wouldn't have gotten everything he wanted. You never do in a divided government, in a negotiation or a divided government where Democrats control the legislature and you control the governorship. But he would have gotten some steps forward. And politically, leave out Republican, Democrat, left, right, conservative, liberal. Politically, I've always been an incrementalist. Things move better when you take small steps toward achieving them rather than bold, sweeping actions on either side. You're more effective. People have the chance to digest the change and adapt to it without major upheaval in any way. Illinois is sinking. It's spending way more than it could ever afford and was for a number of years. But incremental change, had it been accomplished under Pat Quinn, had it been accomplished in the first 2.5 years of Rauner, at least would have been bailing out some of the water from that sinking ship rather than allowing it to take on more water. And that's right, and that's the fundamental problem.
We're talking about like Peoria and the center of the universe thing a little while ago. Does it surprise you a little bit that Peoria has not bred a statewide politician of note to run for a statewide office and be successful at it? We've had some figures around here that have been, like Ray LaHood, for example, who've gone on to national prominence in various ways. It's really been since Ev Dirksen that we've had anybody who's played at the statewide level. And that's 50 years? Right. Now, there might have been the opportunity
for some. There had been chatter, and other things interfered with it at the time, but there had been chatter that Darren LaHood might make a run for statewide office back during the 2014 elections, and a couple of dominoes falling and people jumping in one step lower than they had planned, sort of put the kibosh on that at the time. But that could have been an example of somebody who would have made a statewide run for things. It's a little odd that we haven't, especially given what we have around here that's really unique to the area, and we've written about this in the column a couple of times. You look at the legislative delegations for Aurora, for Elgin, for Rockford, for Champaign, even for Bloomington Normal, and they don't have Decatur, Springfield. They're all good examples of this, but they don't have what we have, which is a delegation that's got one body in each of the four caucuses: House Republicans, House Democrats, Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, and people who, generally speaking, pull together for the betterment of the community. You wouldn't have had something pass like the extension of the historic tax credits downtown for the warehouse district and downtown Peoria if you hadn't had all four of those people whispering in their caucus leader's ear, we really need this down here.
And you're talking about state senator, you're talking about Chuck Weaver,
Jahan Gordon, Dave Kaler, Ryan Spain, and before him, Dave Leach, Mike Eunice to some extent too. Those five really, really do a good job of pulling for the region and the betterment of the area in a way that I've never seen in any other community caucus that's out there. And you would think that would bring people up to a little more statewide prominence than it does. On the other hand, given the poisonous partisan atmosphere down there, there's a little bit of regret to it for some of them, and some people in their caucus. Well, how can you work with them?
Yeah.
Well, because it's my community, and I want it to be a better community at the end of the day. And it's very rare, other than budget votes, it's very rare that we see an instance where they aren't all pulling together. The legislation on increased transparency for Illinois American Water and its finances is an example of that, where you've got Republicans squaring off against Democrats there. And that's really the only distinction I can think of in recent history.
Well, Peoria, I think this area has always been pretty good at bipartisanship, even on the lower levels as well. If you look at the county boards in this area, Peoria County Board in particular seems to, it doesn't seem like party labels really matter all that much at that level.
Right. About the only thing that ends up being Republicans versus Democrats and some Republicans is the issue of the nursing home of Headington Oaks. Other than that one issue, I can't think of anything where you've got a block of people just in one party who are casting votes either for or against something. And it's nice to see because they're representing the interests of their community. They're also odd because they deal with a lot of these problems at the committee level, and you never see protracted debate out on the floor.
No.
It's something that city council could take a lesson from.
Yeah, and as much as I love the Woodford County Board, they could probably take a lesson from it too. And they're all Republicans, so it shows just because you're all in one party doesn't necessarily mean that everything is, simpatico.
Oh, exactly. Remember some of the knockdown, drag-out fights? The Fulton County Board, all Democrats at the time, had 5, 6, 7 years back.
Oh, yeah. It's just because you're all in. So, as somebody once said to me about the Woodford situation, it's like everybody shows up with their letter sweaters, but the R's on some letters are bigger than they are on some of the other sweaters.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. You and I have spent more time probably writing about hot dog stands in the last 3 months than we probably ever envisioned in our entire lives. We're talking about the Portillo's quest to establish a base of operations here in Peoria, which is on again, off again. Who's going to get paid? Is there going to be an extra tax on it? That sort of thing. Does this kind of somehow seem like a little bit of the theater of the absurd in some ways?
It does, and a large part of the blow up late last week. You got people online who are pinning it on, all the negative headlines and things like that. And the simple fact is there weren't 6 votes to pass the proposal that was originally out there to pass for a 30-year 1% added sales tax to pay back the developer. And by everybody going back to their corner, midway through the week last week, and then trying to come out and take another whack at it. It offers an opportunity for everyone to get kind of a dignified solution to it, where there's some compromise involved. And there's a lot of kabuki theater that's involved in this, or frankly any development. We're just seeing a lot more of it out in public here because people are paying a lot more attention to this as a project than they would be the development of a one-off building in the warehouse district.
Because people like to eat.
People like to eat. Well, and you see it in what people click on our website. They love stories about new restaurants. They love stories about restaurants that have closed, that are opening, that are relocating. We love to talk about what we eat. We love to take pictures and throw up on Instagram. Pictures of what we eat. So
we don't like to throw up food on Instagram. We like to throw pictures on Instagram. Let's make that
thank you for correcting my grammar.
And that brings me, I don't want to belabor this too long, and you've got other things to do today, and so do I. But what do you think is the future of the journalism business, the newspaper business? You're talking about people clicking on this, clicking on that. Are we going to be in a position where we're just going to write a bunch of restaurant reviews and write about a new business coming into town, and that's about it? And there's no room for anything more deep than that? Because that's what people want?
People want that, but people also want, at the end of the day, they want an understanding of what's going on in their community and how does it affect them. And you need to look no farther than Portillo's for an explanation for this. People were hugely interested when they had the news that they could get a Portillo's Italian beef in Peoria sometime soon. But what's the reaction been to the proposed tax on it? That's been a whole community debate about that. And the stories about what that means to people and the defense of why the developer needs that tax and the criticism of that tax as setting a precedent for future development, those stories have gotten incredible traction too, and that's a policy discussion about broader issues than just hot dogs that people are interested in, and people have a lot of knee-jerk reactions to those things, and they may still feel the same way after they read all sides of that story, but they're reading all sides of that story and they're understanding it. Some of them are calling BS on some of the explanation one way or the other, but that's what people do when they hear explanations and when they hear public debate is they choose a side, but they do it in an informed way. People are going to read that just as people are going to read stories about whether or not their taxes are increasing and why. In Peoria, it's going to be in large part because of the stormwater utility fee that they're adding in effective midway through next year, which is designed to fix a $300 million problem and stop Peoria from pumping human waste into the river, which I think you'd have to agree is a pretty critical thing for people to be discussing. And whether it's critical or not, we've also got the federales telling us you will solve this, and you will either do it our way or you'll come up with a way. Well, they've come up with a way that they seem to think is cheaper, but we're going to start feeling the pinch, and people need to know about that pinch that's coming.
What do you think is going to be the future as far as taxing and that sort of thing in Peoria? Do you think that are we taxed to the limit at this point as far as our property tax? How's this going to be resolved? Are we going to see more of an increase in taxes, a cutback in services, a little of each?
I think you're going to see a cutback in services, to be sure. City Council has broadly agreed they don't want to increase the property taxes at all, but I think you're going to start to see Peoria moving toward additional service fees, things that are intended to pay for specific things, whether that's the stormwater fee, raising the garbage fee so that people are actually paying what it costs in the garbage contract rather than the city handling a chunk of that itself out of the general fund budget. There was a consideration, and it's been dropped, but a business registration fee to help pay for economic development in Peoria. There's very little that's free, and if the city has a bunch of obligations, not least huge, enormous, blot-out-the-sun obligations for pensions for police and firefighters, they've got to pay those. They made the commitment. They've got to pay to ensure that those pensions are there. Well, there's a lot less money to go around specifically earmarked for some of the wants rather than the must-haves.
Is there anything I'm not asking you about here that I should be? Anything else you'd like to add about anything?
I think we've pretty broadly covered just about everything that's going on right around now.
Covered a lot, and we could probably do
I'm sure we
part
could
two
do
of
another
this.
one of these.
And we probably will at some
Yeah.
point, too. Thanks for being with us today.
My
Chris
pleasure.
Kaergard from the Journal-Star. Read us in Word on the Street every Monday. Read the Journal-Star every day, of course. And always listen to Nick in the Morning, the podcast. Thanks a lot, everybody, for watching or listening today, and we'll see you next time.